First of all, I would like to thank you very much for the invitation, the European Commission, UNDP, the university of your country. I'm very glad to be here. I feel very honored to be here. I must admit it is my first visit here in Riga, so it is very interesting for me to be here, to see your university and to have discussions with colleagues from this university in order to build networks in terms of research and teaching and all these kind of cooperation in an academic sense. What I would like to do today is to talk about development policy towards 2030, Europe's role. And what I would like to do is I have organized my lecture in 3 steps. I would like to start with 3 why questions. The first why question is, why 2030? This looks very much towards the future. Why do I think that it is so important to look towards the future and not only 1 year or 2 years or 3 years? I'm looking towards 2030. Why? The second why question is then, why is Europe's role in development cooperation relevant? Why is it important to think about development cooperation in a European perspective? And I will tell you why I think that it is relevant to think in European terms about development cooperation. And my third why question is then, why do development cooperation in times of economic crisis? You have been telling me that it is very difficult in these times to talk about development cooperation in times of economic crisis at home. I can tell you that it is equally difficult in my country too. So I will tell you why I think that development cooperation in times of crisis are even more important. And thirdly, based on these 3 why questions, I will give you 2 different concepts of development policy, 2 ones. And I will explain you why I favor one of those. So this is the first part on development cooperation, 3 why questions. And I choose these why questions because Kapuscinski, the reporter, he liked questions. I have been reading his books, and I recommend you to read his books too, because he's a great person. He's very authentic, and he loves people, and he loves regions, and he loves culture, and he always loves to ask questions. He very often says in his books that very often it is much more important to define the right questions than to have very rapid answers. So I will ask some questions. This is about development policy, the first part. The second part is then on global development challenges. So what are the major global development challenges? If we talk about development policy, about development cooperation, we need to ask ourselves, what are the main drivers of global development challenges? And I will link the MDG agenda, the poverty agenda, with the climate agenda. And I will tell you that I think that driven by climate change, the 4 fundamentals of human development globally, of human civilization globally, are under stress. And I will tell you which 4 fundamentals I have in mind. So the global challenges, this is the second part of the lecture. And the last and the third part of the lecture is then the global development perspective. So where should we go? If we do have some problems, the global challenges, where should we go? And I will tell you how I reflect on the global development perspectives then. And this is the third part. And for these 3 parts, I do have 60 minutes or something like that. And after that, we will have the chance to discuss this in the context of development policy thinking in your country. And I'm very keen to learn from your side how you reflect on these kind of issues. So this is the program for the next hour or so. And before I start with my why questions, I will give you 4... Oops, what's that? Sorry. Yeah. I would like to give you 4 sentences from Mr. Kapuscinski. And I am saying here that Richard Kapuscinski, the reporter, he was a man with a 360-degree perspective. And when I say 360-degree perspective, what I mean is that he was globally in thinking. He looked always around the world, 300 degrees perspective. He was interested not only in his country, Poland, he was interested in global development and global interdependencies and the impacts of developments in other parts of the world to Europe. So 360-degree perspective in this sense. And he was also a person with a 300-degree perspective in another sense. If you read... Oh, sorry, what's that now? Sorry. If you read his books, you can see that he's interested in economics, he's interested in political sciences and institutions, and he's interested in culture. So he tries to understand the world from very different angles. And I like this kind of perspective, and you will see that I try to bring in his thinking in my lecture here today. And here you have the 4 sentences that I found in his books that are related with our discussion today. The first one is about global development. He says, we cannot understand our problems at home, to say so, if we don't think of them at a global planetary scale. And I will focus on that, because I think that all our developments are part of global development dynamics, and we have to understand these global development and dynamics in order to find answers to our own development too. His second point is very local then, coming from the global to the local. He says, to understand something is to go into other cultures. It is never 100%, but we must try. We must be open to capture the otherness. So global is one perspective, and then go into cultures, into countries, into other contexts to understand the dynamics in other countries and regions. Understand local dynamics, the global and the local, and the interaction between both. This is part of his thinking, and I think that's very relevant to see the world in this way. His third point then is the biggest contradiction in a growing world, and he means here economically growing world, richness, wealth creation and so on, is that while experience is a period of development and progress, the latter yields inequality and justice. And you will see that these two terms, you spoke about solidarity and responsibility. I think this is kind of reflection is linked to what Kapuscinski is saying here. And you will see that from my perspective, if you talk about global development, the equality and the justice term will gain importance. And he is also emphasizing that. And the last point here is on MDGs and poverty, extreme poverty. And he is saying, we are in a world in which man, crawling on the earth, tries to dig a few grains of wheat out of the mud just to survive another day. This is the reality of 1 billion people on earth, extreme poverty. And he tries to bring together these kind of different perspectives on global development. And you will see probably that what I would like to talk about is linked to this kind of thinking. And this is why I'm very proud and honored to be part of the Kapuscinski lecture. Thank you again for the invitation. So now I will start with my 3 why questions. And the first why question is this one here. Why a 2030 perspective? This sounds very much towards the future. 3 waves of global change. And what I would like to argue now is that I think that we should need towards the very long distance, 2030, because the international context in which we have to reflect on development cooperation is not at all stable. It is very volatile. It is changing radically. And development policy is not a small garden within something that is not linked to the rest of other policy dimensions. Development policy, working together between rich countries and poor countries, forms part of the international political and international economic scenario, context. And this international context is changing radically. And this is important to understand if we reflect afterwards on how we should reflect on development policy in the future, because the context is changing radically. And I perceive 3 waves of global change that are driving these radical changes in the international context. So let's go through these 3 waves that are changing the international context. The first point has to do with the current crisis. It is about globalization, how we govern the global economy. And the point here is that our global economy and the global economic governance system might look very different after the economic crisis that we are going through. And I will show you 4 different futures that might emerge, 4 different settings of global economic governance structures that might emerge. And all these 4 different options that we have on the table here would have very different impacts on developing countries and the relationships between developing countries and rich countries, to say it in a very simple way. So 4 different global economic governance structures that might emerge as an impact of the current economic crisis. The first one, let's start with the blue one here, is the most positive one. There are many actors arguing that we need a rebalanced multilateralism. more global economic governance instruments, a better working World Economic Trade Organization, a better or even a financial economic governance structure that we need to implement. You know that the G20 now in Pittsburgh has been discussing which kind of international setting we need to stabilize the global financial markets. So cooperation and a balanced multilateral system might emerge. This is the most positive perspective. But there are three other perspectives. Another one, the second one, is the green one here, re-engineered Western centrism. The perspective here would be that the OECD countries, the industrialized countries, might try to stabilize their privileges in the world, trying to keep the other actors out of the game, trying to stabilize G8, trying to stabilize the Bretton Woods institutions as they are. And you might know that the developing world, the developing countries are arguing that we need more voice in the global economic organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary System. But the OECD countries might try to stabilize their privileges. I think this will not work, but this is the second option that might emerge. The third one is then fragmented protectionism. There is still fear in the international arena that protectionism might appear as a result of the economic crisis. As all nation states around the world currently do have problems with poverty and people without access to the labor markets, one reaction might be a protectionism. This would be very negative in terms of the future development of the global economy, but it might come this way if the crisis would be even stronger during the next month, and we don't know that currently. So this is the third option, more protectionism. And the fourth one here is regionalism. If we would not be able to organize a rebalanced multilateral system, regions might become stronger. I'm just coming back from Beijing. I have been in Beijing last week. And in Asia, the discussion on economic organizations in Asia as a substitute for global arrangement is very strong. So in Asia, we do have a strong debate on regional organizations to stabilize the economic system. And in Europe, we do have such a regional setting. The question then would be, wouldn't this be regions against each other or regions complementary to each other? So these are four very different options that we do have on the tables now when we discuss in the international arenas the consequences of the international financial crisis. And the impacts on developing countries would be huge. The context might be very different. The point that I would like to make is that the situation is not stable. There are very different avenues in front of us. For the developing world, the blue one, the rebalanced multilateralism, would be the most fruitful one. The worst one would be the fragmented protectionism, of course. So very different pictures in front of us in terms of the global economic governance structure. This is why we need to think long-term, because dynamics might be very different. The second point is then tectonic power shifts. This is about economic power and political power. And the major observation here is that globalization is not Westernization. This is a very important sentence, because when we started to discuss globalization, or the literature on globalization that you see that started to be published in the 90s, there have been many authors arguing that what we call globalization, cross-border economic, political and cultural activities, this is about Westernization. This is about Americanization. A friend of mine, Mr. Kapuscinski from the US, an economist and a political scientist, he has written a book that is called Globalization as Westernization, and the second one was Globalization as Americanization. But this is not exactly the reality. What we can see is that tectonic power shifts are reorganizing the global economy and the global international system, with consequences for what we have been calling the North-South relations before. I will show you a diagram to demonstrate that to you. It is this one. We have here we have here 2006 and compared with 2050. So this is a long-term projection now. This is not reality, it is a projection, but these are trends, you know. And we have the yellow column here, and these are the G7 countries. These are the most strongest Western economies globally, G7. And these G7 are compared here, this is a World Bank study, with the so-called E7, the emerging seven. And the emerging seven are China and India and Indonesia and Brazil and Turkey and Mexico and Russia. E7, emerging seven. So, and if you compare the aggregated GDP of G7 and E7 in 2005 or 6, you can see that currently, now, the aggregated GDP of the G7 countries is more or less 3 times bigger than the E7 GDP. And then have a look towards 2050. And you can see that it might be the other way around in 4 decades. The other way around. Here, the E7 countries, 2 times as big as the G7 countries. This would imply a completely different international setting. This would imply a reorganization of the whole global economy. A part of what we have been calling developing countries might become global superpowers. China and India and Brazil and Indonesia and Turkey. And some of them, overall the biggest ones, China and India, are already economic superpowers and at the same time very poor countries. This is completely new in economic history because in the past the most important economic players and the most influential and powerful economic players have always been the richest countries in the world. But now we do have economic superpowers, China and India, that at the same time are poor countries. This is a new situation. So tectonic power shifts. What we have been calling rich countries and poor countries and north-south relationships is changing radically and rapidly. And we need to have this in mind. The global situation is changing and the drivers are strong. We are talking about tectonic power shifts. So let's go then to the third wave of global change. I have been talking about these different global economic governance settings. I've been talking about tectonic power shifts in the global economy. And now I would like to talk about climate change, and I will pick up this point again later on. Climate change is a driver of global change. Climate change not as environmental stress or climate change not as environmental issue. Climate change as a driver of global change because we are reaching the limits of the Earth system by climate change. Climate scientists are telling us that if we go beyond 2 degrees global warming, a 3 degrees plus world or a 4 degrees plus world, the probability that we reach what they call tipping points in the Earth system is rising radically. Tipping points imply that subsystems of the Earth system might collapse. And they locate around 15 of those tipping points. And if these tipping points if we really would reach these tipping points, the impacts of global development and human development on the global economy would be huge. And I will only demonstrate 2 of those tipping points to you so that you understand why this is a driver of global change. Climate change is a driver of global change by reaching these kind of tipping points. The first example that I would like to mention is the Amazon forest in Latin America. And what the scientists are demonstrating to us is that if we would go up to a global warming around 3 to 4 degrees until the end of the century, the Amazon forest that you can see there in the left-hand side up, that is very dense in 2020, will be collapsed or might collapse in 2090, until 2099. A collapse of the Amazon forest. A collapse of the Amazon forest would destroy for completely the agricultural potentials of Latin America, because this would imply a desertification of the whole continent. So this would imply huge impacts on agricultural organization in Latin America, on rural poverty, on producing food, on access to water. This is the first tipping point, the Amazon forest. And there is a second tipping point on the other side of the world. The models are demonstrating, I don't have the diagram here today, but the models are demonstrating that within a global warming process, around 3-4 degrees plus globally, the monsoon in Asia might collapse. And as you know, the monsoon in Asia is the motor, the driver of agricultural development in Asia. So if the monsoon collapses, we don't know exactly what is behind the collapse of the monsoon. So we are manipulating the huge elements of the ecosystem without knowing exactly how to stabilize the situation afterwards. This is why I call climate change a driver of global change. And this is why I argue in favor of looking towards the future, 2030 and even beyond, because the international system might change radically. And these are the three main drivers. The global economic system might be very different during the next decades. Global tectonic shifts in terms of power, G7, E7, and climate change as a driver of global change. So this is why I think we need to look into the future. And it is not enough to understand only the current situation. So the second question then is, why is Europe's role in development cooperation relevant? And I would like to emphasize 5 points here. The first one has already been mentioned by one of the previous speakers. 60% of the international ODA, these are the Overseas Development Assistance Aid investments, are European, 60%. So the majority of the international investments in development cooperation are coming from European member states or the European Union as a transnational organization. 60%. And I would like to see this 60% translating into political capital. My perception is that we do invest a lot of money in this policy era, but on the global scale, we are not always the most important actors. We do not have the influence that we might have if we would work together closely. We do have, in reality, behind the 60% of international ODA, which is European, 27 member states and the European Commission. So we are 28 actors. And we are investing 60% of the global ODA funds, but fragmented. So this is my first point. 60%, we should translate this into political capital. The second point is then that 65% of all bilateral donors are actually European countries. Only 35% are non-European countries. So we have a majority here too. But this does not translate again into political capital on the global scale. If you look to the Bretton Woods institutions, for example, many observers argue with very good arguments that they are mainly driven by the United States. And our influence as Europeans is not strong enough. And I think there are good arguments to say so, but we could change that because 65% of the bilateral donors are European countries. And what is as important is that what we have been learning in development cooperation regarding effectiveness of development cooperation is that it is important that the donor countries really work together. We have so many studies on aid effectiveness that demonstrates that if in a recipient country, let's say Namibia or Mali or other countries around the world, if you do have in a certain sector, let's say health, 30 or 35 different donor organizations from around the world, this is not working. This is very expensive. It produces high transaction costs, and it very often overburdens the institutional structures and the governance structures of the recipient countries. It is not working. We need to work together. And in Europe, we do have responsibility here. You talked about responsibility, because we do have the chance as Europeans to pool our development cooperation funds and work together in certain countries. Since 2007 in the European Union, we do have a code on division of labor. This is very important. And the main idea is that if we work as Europeans in Nicaragua, for example, we shouldn't have 12 or 15 European member countries working in one sector in Nicaragua. infrastructure, health, social development, environmental policies. This is not working. The costs of fragmentation are very, very high. Imagine if you would have to reorganize your health system, and you would have to cooperate and work together with 25 international actors. This will not work. And this is not working in development cooperation too. This is why we need to work together as Europeans. We do have a responsibility here. The third point is that Europe can make a difference in many developing regions of the world, in Africa, in Latin America, in different parts of Asia. We, as European member states, in the global context, we are all small and medium-ranged nation states. We need to realize that. We do have the United States, we do have China, we do have India, we do have Russia. And our member states in Europe, we are small. In the new global economy with these tectonic power shifts, we are small and medium-ranged countries. And this is why we should work together in order to make a difference. As European actors working together, we can make a difference. So this is why Europe is important. My fourth point here is that, from my perspective, the European Union is a fascinating laboratorium for regional and cross-border cooperation. And this is a very relevant experience for international development cooperation too. Because not only we, but all countries around the world, we are all challenged by cross-border challenges, by globalization impacts. And the only way to manage globalization impacts is by working together internationally. And Europe is a very interesting model where we have, during the last 5 decades, started to learn to work together in a regional context. And I'm traveling around a lot internationally, and I know that these kind of experiences, how we do that, which kind of institutions work, and which kind of institutions do not work, this is a relevant experience for international development cooperation. And my last point here is more a question than an answer. I'm often being asked by developing country colleagues or entrepreneurs or political decision makers, does Europe has a specific development model from which we can learn? Are you different from Canada or the US or Japan? What are your specifics in Europe? And I think that this is a very interesting question. We are going to discuss this on Friday in Stockholm during the European Development Days. Do we have a European flavor to offer? Is this about embedded market? It's not only about free markets, it is about embedded markets in terms of social development and environmental development. It is about freedom, democracy and human rights as values that we push forward in the European Union. It is about building a we identity as European citizens in Europe. These might be elements of what could be the European model, and what other countries and regions in the developing world might learn from us or interact in these areas with us. So these are some arguments why Europe is important in development cooperation, why only national foci on development cooperation are concepts of the past, I would argue. I'm a strong advocate of European development policy activities and pooling our resources in terms of financial resources, personal resources and technical know-how that we have to offer. So the third question then is the crisis question. The third question is, why development policy in times of economic crisis at home? And I'm giving you here 7 arguments based on, I call it, enlightened self-interests. And this list is from the German debate, actually. As you might know, we did have elections 2 or 3 weeks ago. And we do have a new coalition now, and a new government is coming into power, and currently they are negotiating about priorities in their political program. And I wrote an article in a newspaper asking this question, because this is not only a question in your country, it's also a question in our country. The economic situation in Germany is difficult. Our economic growth is declining heavily, 5 to 6% this year. I know in your country it's even more difficult, but in Germany this is an economic shock. And this is why this question, why to invest now in development cooperation, is also asked in Germany. And here I have 7 arguments why we should invest in development cooperation. And I will go through these arguments, and you might reflect whether this is helpful for your debate here in your country too. The first one is very simple. The first one is arguing that strengthening economic development and stability in developing countries is an investment in new export markets and in international stability. And Europe is an export-oriented nation. Most of our national economies are global exporters. So we need new markets and we need international stabilization in a stable environment. So investing in developing countries and investing in economic and social development in developing regions is also investing in new markets. China is growing rapidly. We are not only importing from China, we are exporting to China. India, the same story. Many Asian countries that have been poor in the past are growing now, and these are important export markets. So this is the first argument. It is very easy. The second one is that most what we might call world problems, like climate change, the international financial markets and how to stabilize those, migration, fragile states, international terrorism, all these kind of international problems, most of those problems, we can't solve them without cooperating with developing countries. So the idea that we can manage these global interdependencies within the European Union context or the OECD context or the G8 context is not working. We need to cooperate with developing countries in order to tackle these kind of world problems. Our colleague from the European Union has been talking about solidarity and responsibility. And what I would argue here is that invest in development cooperation. I say investments. I don't like the word aid. Aid is like something, I'm a rich person, I'm helping you. And no one likes to be helped all the time. And what we should say is, we would like to cooperate with you. It's development cooperation. And the point here is, if we would like to solve problems jointly, this is about reciprocity. I cooperate with you to solve a joint problem. This joint problem might be stabilize the forest in Brazil, because this is important in terms of climate change. So these kind of cooperation, this is the second argument. The third argument is that we should be strongly interested in investing in global governance capacities of developing countries. What does this mean? We are talking about how to reorganize the international financial markets. We have the World Trade Organization setting. And to be able to play a role in these international arenas, countries need capacities to do so. And many countries do not have the capacities to move in these settings because there is a lack of research and capacity building in these countries, or many of these countries, regarding global governance issues. If it is so, this is a problem of legitimacy in the international global governance arenas. Because if these countries do not participate and do not have the chance to influence what is going on globally, these rules will not be legitimate. This is why G8 is going out and G20 is coming in. So investing in global governance capacities in developing countries is very important. In Germany, we do have several programs regarding these kind of activities. For example, we do have a fund to invest in trade negotiation skills in developing countries, to be able to play a role in the World Trade Organization rounds, etc., etc. So this is the third point here. The fourth point is that development cooperation is very often about good governance and promoting democracy. And investing in good governance settings in developing countries and democracy is also in our own interest, because this has to do with being able to cooperate. It's much easier to cooperate with other democracies than with authoritarian states. And this has to do with peace and less conflicts, because democracies do not attack each other. So investing in democracy is investing in less conflicts, democracy promoting. The fifth point here is then that Europe needs partners beyond the OECD world. I have been showing you that the setting that I have had in my mind. I have been born in the 60s, so I have grown up in the golden times of the transatlantic global system. We saw as the international system in the global economy as if it were dominated by the transatlantic organizations, US and Europe driving the rest of the world. But this is now disappearing, tectonic power shifts. And this is why we need partners around the world, in other continents. And development cooperation is not only about fighting poverty, it's always about investing in cooperation and trust and new networks with people in other parts of the world. And this is very important for our economic and political development globally. So my sixth point is then, investing in trust, cooperation, and reciprocal behavior is investing in the social capital of what I would call the global society. If globalization and global interdependency translates in problems that we have to solve as a global community, the global crisis is one currently. Climate change is obviously another one. We need to invest in what we call at the national level social capital. And I think development cooperation investments are investments in social capital in this sense. And then the last point is very often the starting point when we start to argue in favor of development cooperation. It is about norms, it is about values, it is about solidarity, it is about responsibility for others. In terms of our foreign policies or foreign-oriented policies should be based on solidarity, human rights and humanity. And I agree completely. This is very, very important. But I would like to link this argument that is based on norms and values and solidarity and helping others with the other arguments that has to do with enlightened interests. Bringing those two concepts together is, from my perspective, very important. So this was my third development policy question. And I would then, to finish the first part, I would then like to separate two different concepts of development policy that we are also discussing at the European level currently. The first one is a more narrow focus on development policy. It is focused on the MDG agenda, on the MDGs, on the poverty reduction agenda, and it is focused on the poorest people in the poorest countries. Maybe some of you have been reading a very famous book, or a book that has become very famous during the last 2 years or so, from Paul Collier. It's called The Bottom Billion. And he's arguing in favor of a development policy with very good arguments that we need to focus our development cooperation on the bottom billion, the poorest people, extreme poverty, wherever they are. Let's focus on that. From my perspective, and this is then the second concept of development policy, this is only a part of the development policy agenda. Because if we understand development policy as the cooperation between industrialized countries and developing countries, emerging countries, if we define development policy in this context, the poverty agenda is part of it, but there are other elements that we need to bring in. I have 3 or 4 here, and I have been mentioning those before. The first one is about the poverty agenda, investing in the social development and economic development in developing countries. This is the MDG agenda, to say so. But the second one is to tackle world problems together, where we need to cooperate, because if we don't cooperate with developing countries, we cannot even solve the problem. So this would be a second element. Then strengthen the global governance capacities of developing countries. I have been spoken about that. And influence from a development policy perspective relevant international regimes that are important for developing countries. The WTO, the Kyoto process, this is climate policy, international financial order. So development policy trying to shape the other arenas that are relevant for developing countries. In the European Union, this is one of the challenges. How development policy and the Commissioner can try to influence our trade policy, because we see that from time to time our European trade policy is counterproductive from a development policy perspective. So shaping from a development policy perspective other international policies would then be part of the development policy agenda. From my perspective, the second concept of development policy is more convincing, but it is at the same time more challenging, of course. So this is about development policy. Let's come now to the second part of my lecture. This is about global development challenges. And I will focus on climate change issues and what I call the 4 fundamentals of human development. And this is what I would like to talk about now. Let's start with 2 lists. These are results from a United Nations University research project published last year. And their question was, where is humanity, where are we as human beings, as global community, where are we losing and where are we winning? And the result is interesting, because if you see the list here on the left-hand side, and if you have a look on the last 50 years or so, where are we winning? We are winning in terms of globally, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of less infant mortality, in terms of literacy, in terms of poverty reduction, although we do have huge problems here. You have been talking about rising poverty numbers now in the financial crisis. But if you have in front of you the last 50 years in general, the trend is poverty. We are reducing poverty on a global scale. GDP per capita is growing around the world. We have less conflicts between states. We have more internet users in many parts of the world. And then where are we losing? This is the right-hand side here. We are losing in terms of CO2 emissions. We are losing in terms of global warming. We are losing in terms of terrorism, of corruption, of ecosystems, of unemployment and social polarization. We are losing in terms of voting population. Democracy is coming, but people do not vote. So something is not working well. To say so, we are losing, and we do have problems regarding systemic issues. Global warming is not only focusing on reducing child mortality. It's much more complex to fight global warming. And we are losing where global and local issues are coming together, transnational terrorism, for example. So we do have these local, global problems. The impacts, the dark sides of globalization are not well managed and governed by the global community. We do have, on the MDG side to say so, social development, economic development, we do have some progress. But we do have these kind of systemic issues and dark side of globalization issues and more local, global linked problems. So this is an entry point, global challenges. My second point is then this graph here, this diagram. This is also from the same project, research project, driven by the United Nations University, and they tried to figure out the 15 most important global challenges facing humanity. And I will go through them, I will only read them. We do not have the time to go into those, although it would be interesting to do so. It's about sustainable development, clean water, population, democratization, long-term perspectives, convergence of IT, rich-poor gap, health, capacity to decide, peace and conflict, status of women, transnational organized crime, energy, science and technology, global ethics. So this is a whole range of global challenges. The important point here is that we all know that with only national efforts, we will not solve these kind of problems. We need global cooperation to manage these kind of challenges. This is important. These are global challenges, and we need transnational answers to. But I will focus on climate change and the related impacts of climate change, because my feeling is that this is the most important driver of, to say so, global bads, and I will show you why I think it is so. So it's about climate. It's about climate and the Earth system, and I will show you why this is really preoccupying me. So you probably know this global warming curves. This is the global temperature during the last 500, 600 years, and this is what we have in front of us during the century. The best case is that we will see a global warming around 2 degrees Celsius until the end of the century, 2 degrees. This is absolutely best case. We can't stay below. I will show you afterwards why. And the worst case would be a global temperature rise around 6 to 7 degrees until the end of the century. 6 to 7 degrees plus until the end of the century. And what I would like to do is to say something about the scope of the problem. Why is this a problem? I have been given many talks about climate change. Very often the question is, isn't that wonderful? It's becoming warmer. Now it is becoming warmer. Less sweaters and more T-shirts, to say so. But this is a real problem here, and I will tell you why the scope of the problem is really on a global scale, on an unprecedented scale. 3 arguments. If you look towards the last ice age, 20,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago it was 4 degrees colder. 4 degrees colder. And as you know, the ice shields of the north of the Arctic has been covering huge parts of Europe, until Berlin, for example, and huge parts of North America. So the Earth system during the Ice Age was completely different. What I want to say here is that now we are talking about 4 degrees plus within a century. And this would imply Earth system change. Earth system change. This has to do with the tipping points I have been talking before. 4 degrees Celsius plus within a century is about Earth system change. We would organize, driven by our greenhouse gas emissions, an Earth system change. And these tipping points might come into play. This is the first point. This is 4 degrees. The second point is that as human beings, we do not have experience with this kind of global warming within such a short period of time. Since the Neolithic revolution 10,000 years ago, when when human mankind started to organize agriculture and villages and construct buildings and so on, when we started our civilization process, to say so, since this period of time, 10,000 years ago, our global climate is very, very stable. We do not have any experience how to manage that. We do not know what is coming on. And as we can learn now in the financial crisis, for example, is how important it is to have experiences. The human mankind, global decision makers, failed in the financial crisis in the 30s. We didn't know how to manage that. And regarding the climate crisis, we do not have experiences how to manage that. During the current financial crisis, we try to learn from our experiences. In this case, we do not have experiences. The third point here is talking about the scope of the problem. The third point is that not only we as human beings do not have experiences with global warming, the Earth system does not have experiences with this kind of global warming. We have never seen, this is what climate science is telling us, during the last 400,000 years, we have never seen a century with a fluctuation of more than half a degree Celsius, minus or plus. 0.5 degrees plus or minus. We have never seen more than that. And now the minimum is 2 degrees Celsius within a century, and 6 to 7 in the worst case scenario. So this is completely new for the Earth system too. And we do not know exactly how the Earth system, this is again about tipping points, will react. So this is the scope of the problem. This is something unprecedented. And I will go into my 4 fundamentals now. Oops. This is about Uppsala. I wanted to show you that. If we talk about climate change dynamics, it becomes clear that the 4 fundamentals of global development, of human development, or I would say of our civilization as mankind are coming under stress. This is what Kapuscinski says. He says, we are rich, we are economically growing, we have a huge global economy, but we are undermining the basics of our societies. And this is what I wanted to focus on. The 4 fundamentals of every or each civilizations are soil and food. We need to eat. Water, we need to drink. Atmosphere, we need to breathe. And energy. We all need energy to produce something, to organize mobility. These are the 4 most fundamental pillars, to say so, of each civilization. Not only in the developing world, also on a global scale. We need food and water, we need atmosphere, we need energy, and we need water. And what I would like to show you is that climate change is putting these 4 fundamentals under stress. So let's start with water. Water, globally. And the picture is this one. Uppsala, sorry. It is this one. Let's start with the water map today. This is the situation of water accessibility globally currently. This is a map from 2005 or 2006. Everything what is blue here is wonderful, access to water, and we do not have any problem. We do have some red areas here. In these regions, the access to water is difficult because we have physical water problems. There is no water, or very little water. As you can see, in most of these regions, there are not living many people. Because there is no water, people are not living there, of course. Then we do have Africa here in something like brown or so. These are not physical water problems. This is what development researchers call socio-economic water problems. Socio-economic water problems. The water is there, but we do not have access of poor people to the water. It's a question of infrastructure. It's a question of the capacity to pay for water. It's a question of technical skills of people to manage water, these kind of issues. These are infrastructural and logistical problems. The water is there. So to say so, we are in a comfortable situation currently. So let's have a look into 2040, I think, 2040, 2070. The world on a road towards a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius plus world. This is not worst case. This is not 6 to 7 degrees plus until the end of the century. This is the world in the mid of the century on the road to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. And what you can see here is that, again, red is physical water problems. We might live in a world where water will really become a scarce product, not only locally, what we have been seeing before, but globally, in entire regions. Have a look on Africa. We have been seeing that we do have currently socio-economic water problems. We will have physical water problems. And look at Latin America again. Latin America is absolutely blue here, with the exception of the east coast of the west coast of Peru, where we have a stone desert. But the rest is blue. And look at Latin America in 2040, physical water problems. So this is the first fundamental, a world with physical water problems in entire regions around the world. How are we going to manage that? Who is going to pay for the infrastructure that we need to handle these kind of problems? And this is driven by climate change. So I'm coming to the second fundamental. The second fundamental is about arable land and food. We all need to eat. So how is the situation? Let's have a look. We will not have the look on that. This is the first. And I brought two. I brought two maps again. This is again a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius plus world. So the middle range scenario at the end of the century, in 2080, 2090. And the red areas that you are seeing here will be in a process of desertification, deserts, droughts at the end of the century, with 3 to 4 degrees Celsius plus. You can see, for example, the Amazon region here. This is what I've been talking about before. The Amazon might collapse with processes of desertification as a result in the whole continent afterwards. So we will have problems in Latin America. We will have problems in Middle America. We will have problems in parts of the US too. We will have problems in the southern parts of Europe too. And we will have challenges in the southern parts of South Africa too. So in these regions, the red ones, agriculture as we know it will not work. This is the first map. There is a second map. This is on droughts and desertification. The second one is on soil degradation. This is not desertification. This is not about a lack of water. What is happening here, I will show you a Chinese map to demonstrate what's happening here. This is a Chinese map. And what we see here is that if we would have 3 to 4 degrees Celsius global warming, it would become much warmer in the northwestern part of China than in the rest of the country. And this would be combined with very strong rainfalls in the same region. And this phenomenon will occur in many regions around the world. So strong heat waves combined with very strong rainfalls. And this together results in degradation of arable land. And the regions that will be affected are those painted in red here. And what you can see is that combined with the other map, that beyond Latin America and the US and Africa, India and China will be very affected, the two most populated nations on Earth. So if you put these two maps together, the result is that arable land will be a scarce product in a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius plus world. Global warming is undermining our ability to produce enough food for a rising global population. And as you know, currently we are on Earth 6.7 billion people. We will be 9 billion people until 2050, but with less arable land. And how are we going to manage that? So this is then the second fundamental of civilization, the second fundamental of human development: food and arable land. Driven by climate change, it will be a scarce product. Let's go to the third one now. The third one was energy, I think. It was energy. So let's go to let's start with the atmosphere thing, with atmosphere and climate stability. So what's about atmosphere? If we talk about the atmosphere, the important thing is that we know that greenhouse gases are driving climate change. And science and most decision makers globally, 130 governments agree on that, argue that we should not go beyond this threshold of 2 degrees Celsius plus. We should stop global warming at 2 degrees Celsius plus. So if we would like to do that really, this would imply that we will be confronted with a limited global budget of greenhouse gases that we still can emit into the atmosphere. We can calculate that. This is an example that we calculated. If we would like to reach the 2 degrees Celsius limit with a probability of only 50%, we would have between 2000 and 2050 1,750 gigatons of greenhouse gases that we still can emit to the atmosphere. This is limited. If we go beyond, global warming will be higher. So the greenhouse gas budget that we need to manage globally is limited now. The bad news here is that we already emitted a third of that, so that is what we do have in front of us in terms of what we still can emit is around 750 gigatons or so. So the atmosphere is a scarce product, to say so. This is the third fundamental of human development. I will then come to the fourth fundamental, and this is about energy. I've been talking about water, I've been talking about arable land and food, I've been talking about the atmosphere and the limited budget of greenhouse gas emissions that we still have within the limits of the 2 degrees Celsius global warming. The fourth point is then energy, the way we produce energy, because behind the greenhouse gas emissions is our energy system. Our energy system is driving global warming. Our energy system is producing greenhouse gases. And the problem is that if you look here at this diagram, in 2000 and 2010, 90% of our global energy system is fossil driven. These are greenhouse gas emissions. This is oil and gas and coal. Our energy system is driven by fossil energy systems. And we need to convert this global energy system into a renewable energy-based system during the next decades towards 2050, 2100. The system that we need would look like this. Renewables, this is the larger part of the picture. We would need to finish the burning coal. We would need to finish more or less burning petroleum and oil, and we need to build a renewable-based global energy system. In Europe, we start to reflect on how we could do that in Europe. We need to translate our 90-10% energy system, 90 fossil, 10 renewable, to 90-10, but the other way around, 10 fossil and 90 renewable. And this during the next decades, until mid of the century, more or less. So this is the fourth fundamental. If we would not be able to do so, reorganize for completely our energy system, we cannot solve our climate problem. And if we cannot solve our climate problem, we cannot stabilize our 4 fundamentals of human development. And this is about water, about food and arable land, about our energy system and the atmosphere. So this is interconnected. This is what I wanted to transmit to you. And I'm coming now, during the next 5-7 minutes, is this okay with the time schedule? To the last point. This is about global development perspectives then. If we do have these kind of problems, what can we do? And how can we stabilize our 4 fundamentals of each civilization? So let's have a look on that. And the major point here is, if we look into the future and global development in the future, the major point is that, and I have been talking about the energy systems, we need to build a global low-carbon economy. A global low-carbon economy. We need to finish the fossil era of the last 250 years after the Industrial Revolution, and we need to build a non-fossil global economy during the next 50 years or so. This is what is the challenge in front of us, and then I will reflect a bit on what this might imply for development cooperation, because this is not only a problem for OECD countries, it is overall a problem for developing countries. So let's have a look what we need to do in order to build a global low-carbon economy. And I have here the 4 most important elements or targets that we need to achieve in order to maintain within the 2 degrees Celsius corridor, to say so. And what we need to do to stay below the 2 degrees Celsius global warming until the end of the century are these 4 points. The first point is that we need to peak with our greenhouse gas emissions globally until the latest 2020, between 2015 and 2020. Have a look on these curves here. What you can see is that if we would be able to stop global warming on the level where we are today, we would be able to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 2% per year until mid of the century, and we would stay below the 2 degrees Celsius global warming. So this would be fine, but this is not possible because our global greenhouse gas emissions are growing rapidly currently. So in 2010 we cannot stop. But if we stop in 2020, we would need to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions annually by 6% per year. This is more than difficult. We haven't seen during the last 200 years these kind of efficiency rates annually during decades. So the message here is we need to peak with our global greenhouse gas emissions within the next 5 to 7 years. This is the first challenge. And this with a growing China, and this with a growing India, and this was hopefully a growing Europe. But we need to peak with the greenhouse gas emissions until 2015, 2020 at the absolutely latest. The second point is then, if we look towards 2050, compatible with 2 degrees Celsius, the best case scenario, and beyond that, dangerous climate change is starting, we need to bring down our per capita emissions globally to 1 ton per person. 1 ton per person. We in Europe are currently emitting 10 tons per person. You in your country, you are emitting 3.5 tons per person. You are in a better position than Germany, for example. We are emitting 11 tons per person. But in Europe as a whole, 10. In the US, 20. In China, 4.6 tons per person. In India, 1.2. So we need to come down to the Indian level of greenhouse gas emissions towards 2050. This is a low-carbon revolution. This is about carbon efficiency. And carbon efficiency is the last point here. We need to improve our carbon efficiency. This is the amount of emissions of greenhouse gases to produce our GDP. We need to improve our carbon efficiency from 1.3%, this is the efficiency rate of the last 2 decades, to 5 to 7% during the next 4 decades or so. So this is what we need to do. This is a low-carbon revolution. And what has this to do now with developing countries? I will tell you what this has to do with developing countries, because we calculated which countries need to start rapidly with stabilizing and then reducing their greenhouse gas emissions during the next years and decades. And what is coming out of this game, and for those of you who are interested, I brought the study here. We took all the global emissions and then we said the distribution to build national greenhouse gas budgets should be on equal emission rights. So every person on Earth has the same right to emit greenhouse gas emissions, because this is something absolutely vital for every person on Earth. And if you build these type of national greenhouse gas budgets, then our question was, how long would the national budgets of different countries last compatible with the 2 degrees Celsius target? And what is coming out is that if we would stabilize our greenhouse gas emissions globally tomorrow and maintain this level, we would run out of our greenhouse gas budget globally in the world within the next 25 years. Within the next 25 years. So in 2035 we would reach the limit of our greenhouse gas budget globally that is compatible with the 2 degrees Celsius target. This is the world. Let's have a look on Germany. We would run out of our national budget within the next 10 years. The US within the next 6 years. Europe, the European Union as a community, within the next 12 years. So we are very near the point where we are, to say so, carbon bankrupt, if we really would like to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius goal. And then let's have a look on some developing countries. And we have some developing countries that also do have huge problems. We see China, it would run out of the national budget within the next 24 years, like the world as a whole, because the greenhouse gas emissions on average globally are comparable with the Chinese ones. So China is in trouble too. Look at Mexico here. It would run out of the budget in 26 years. Russia within the next 9 years. India, 88 years, more space to emit something more. But the main message here is that to solve the climate problem, it is not enough that only the industrialized countries start to reduce radically their greenhouse gas emissions. Also developing countries, overall emerging economies, need to start to stabilize and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions very radically. We calculated this for different parts of the world, and as you can see that even in Africa we need to bring down the greenhouse gas emissions to be able, as a global community, to solve the 2 degrees Celsius target. So this is the challenge that we are confronted with. Greenhouse gas emissions have to come down. Low carbon development is the most important issue to manage the 4 fundamentals that I have been talking about. And this is why I argue for bringing together the MDG agenda, poverty, with the low carbon agenda, because without the low carbon agenda we will not win, never ever, the MDG agenda, the poverty agenda, because if we move forward with our high carbon growth pattern worldwide, we will undermine the 4 fundamentals of human civilization that I have been talking about. So some suggestions, and I'm finishing with this, for development cooperation. I think that we need to write low carbon into our system. Write low carbon into our system. And beyond the MDGs, we suggest that we need to accept some other low carbon targets for developing countries too. And here we have some examples. We need to accept, for example, that towards 2050, no country on Earth should have a greenhouse gas emission per capita beyond 1 ton, because this is what we need globally to be able to solve the climate problem. This should be a target for developing countries too. More than half of the developing countries are already beyond this threshold. This is the first point. A second issue here is that we can calculate that from now on to 2050, for every person on Earth, we do have 2.5 tons per capita greenhouse gas emissions available to come down then to 1 ton in 2050. We should not go beyond this threshold in developing countries either. And this should therefore be a target for development cooperation. And we then suggest that we need to bring together poverty reduction strategies with low-carbon strategies. And we are starting to do so and to reflect on that, but we do not have concepts. We need to invest in these kind of concepts. And on Friday, during the European Development Days in Copenhagen, we do have a workshop on these kind of questions. How can we combine low-carbon development with poverty reduction? Because we know there is no way and no option for developing countries to repeat the high carbon growth pattern. This will not work if we would like to solve the climate problem. So we need to combine poverty reduction with low carbon strategies and low carbon issues, and we need to bring this into our development cooperation system and into our development discourses and discussions with partner countries around the world. So let's finishing then, I will skip this, let's finishing then with Europe again, last two slides. If we have in front of us this kind of panorama, the global challenges, the erosion of the four fundamentals of human development, and then as a perspective to bring together low carbon development with poverty reduction, how could Europe's role look like? And this is of course now a very optimistic perspective. I would like to see Europe pushing the global climate negotiation process. I would like to see Europe as a driver of a proactive and strict climate policy. And I hope to see this kind of result in Copenhagen in some weeks, where we are going to negotiate the climate regime. And I would like to see Europe as a pioneer for a low carbon economy. And this would be important for global development as such, because this would imply that we put the four fundamentals less under stress. And this is probably at the same time the way to build economic advantages and competitive economic advantages into the future. The global economy of the future must be much greener than today. And there's a huge competition between different actors. As I said, I'm coming from China, and I have been in Beijing during the last days. And in Beijing, if you talk to the climate advisors, you hear two different perspectives. That's very interesting. The first perspective is that we are not moving forward regarding reducing reducing greenhouse gases and being cooperative in Copenhagen if the US guys don't play into the right direction. So if the US don't go into the right direction, reduce their greenhouse gases, we will not move, because this is unfair cooperation then. This will not work. This is one perspective. This is, let's say, the mainstream perspective. But within the same group of climate advisors to the Chinese government, you are hearing a completely different argument now too. And this group is arguing that climate policy is about innovation and is about the next wave of green growth. And China might be the pioneer of this new green growth wave. And China is now the country on earth that is giving credits to all the other ones. As you know, the US need to borrow money from China. And also some European countries borrowed money from China. So the new heart of the international financial system is there. And if you look on the global currency reserves, the biggest fund of currency reserves, $2.2 trillion, are in Shanghai and Beijing. So their argument is that we move forward. We might be the pioneer in low carbon development. So there is a competition regarding low carbon growth towards the future. I would like to see Europe on the forefront here, of course. Then regarding development cooperation, I would advocate for merging the MDG agenda plus the low carbon agenda. This is what I have been arguing for during the last minutes. In the cooperation between the European Union and Africa, we need to bring together Millennium Development Goals, investments in agriculture and food, with adaptation to climate change and low carbon development also in Africa, regarding solar energy patterns, for example. In our cooperation with India and China, we need to build low-carbon partnerships, because these are the two most important actors on Earth beyond the OECD world if we talk about the solution of the climate problem. We should invest in partnerships with China and India to help these countries to build low-carbon infrastructures in their economies. And this is part of a broader development cooperation agenda too. And the last very important point here is that 20% of the climate problem is about forests. So 20% of the greenhouse gases are coming from burning forests internationally. And we need to stop that. And in order to stop burning and cutting forests in developing countries, we need to pay people not to cut those. And this is a good investment because it is stopping global greenhouse gases. And this is my last slide here. This is, as you can see, the Earth. This is a picture made from one of the first Apollo space shuttles. So one of the first pictures from the Earth from the outside. And why did I choose this picture? I choose this picture because we had a conference in London very recently on these four fundamentals and global climate change and human development. 60 researchers from around the world and 20 of those Nobel laureates, because we wanted to bring in the Nobel laureates from different sciences to help us to solve the climate challenge. At the end of the conference, one of the Nobel laureates demonstrated exactly this photo to all of us. And he said that after having discussed about climate change and global development and human development and these four fundamentals that we also have been discussing about here today, I think that there are two, he thought that there are two very good news and two real challenges. The first very good news from his side, an economist, he said that we do have the money to solve the problem. We do have the money to build a low-carbon economy and to fight poverty. Because to do that, we need around 1.5% of our global GDP to do so. We can't do that. This would not imply to create a financial crisis or something like that. 1.5% of the global GDP, this is manageable. We are investing currently between 3.5 to 5% of our global GDP to fight the financial crisis. So we can do that. The financial resources are there. First good news. The second good news was then the technologies are there. We are not confronted with a problem that we cannot change. We can shape the problem and solve the problem because the technologies, the low-carbon technologies, are already there. We need to invest in those. And then the two big challenges globally. The first big challenge is the time scale. We have been seeing that the peak that we need to reach regarding the greenhouse gases globally is between 2015 in 5 years to 2020 at the latest. So the time framework to manage the problem is really a huge challenge. We need to act really quick. We do not have decades to move forward. It's a time of acting rapidly. This is the first major challenge, time, the time schedule. And the fourth schedule has to do then with this photo. And this is about international cooperation. And this is about responsibility and solidarity, because what we can argue is that with all our data that we bring together is that for fighting dangerous climate change, we need to bring not only the industrialized countries onto low-carbon growth patterns, we need to bring also all developing countries on low-carbon growth patterns. If not, it will not work. But to do so, we will really need a global approach and a global effort, solidarity and responsibility, to push this forward. We cannot solve this problem alone, not within G8 or the European Union or the transatlantic system. We need to bring all the developing countries in too. If not, we will fail. So the last point, the challenging point then, beyond the time aspect and the time frame, is what he called global we identities. Because to act together, to cooperate, what you need is something like a we identity. This is what also, and I'm coming to the beginning again, finishing, this is also what Europe is about. What we need in Europe to be able to cooperate is a we identity. If we do not understand ourselves in Europe as Europeans, our cooperation will not work. Why should some countries invest in the development of other countries? This is about we identities. So to cooperate, you need we identities. And in Europe, we are on the way to build those. It's not always very easy, but we try to do so. But now we need this on a global scale to solve the climate problem and to invest and stabilize to invest into and stabilize these four fundamentals that I have been talking about, water and food, arable land, energy and atmosphere, we need a global focus. And this is why development cooperation is not only about aid. Development cooperation is about investing in a joint and common future regarding global development. And this is what I wanted to tell you. Thank you very much for your patience.